Before we begin, a word of caution to the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. This content is crafted for entertainment and dramatic storytelling, but what you're about to hear touches on real emotions, real pain, and the very real consequences of public humiliation. Now, what happens when a living legend, a man whose music shaped the cultural heartbeat of multiple generations, steps onto a show stage expecting respect, professionalism, and a conversation rooted in truth, only to be met by a host who believes scandal is more interesting than achievement? What happens when a man who sold over 250 million records worldwide, who has been honored by royalty, who's raised millions for charity, and who has weathered every imaginable storm with dignity, is confronted by someone who thinks unresolved controversy is more compelling than a lifetime of iconic work? This is not a hypothetical. This actually happened. This is what unfolds when someone who survived false accusations that nearly destroyed his entire life meets a host who believes that dragging up resolved trauma counts as brave journalism. When an interview meant to celebrate music, memoir, and resilience turns into an interrogation based on allegations that were thoroughly investigated, entirely discredited, and legally dismissed, yet still clung to by those who find someone's wounds more entertaining than their victories. What you're about to witness is not just another uncomfortable celebrity interview. It's not just another example of a talk show host pushing boundaries. It's not even merely a moment of tension on daytime television. This is the moment Sir Cliff Richard, Britain's longest surviving pop star, a man who has stood on stages for over 60 years, who has inspired millions, who has stared down the darkest side of the media, finally said enough. This is the moment he faced someone who believed that being cleared of all wrongdoing somehow still left questions worth asking. Someone who believed that innocence, once proven, could still be treated like a technicality. Someone who thought that a man's pain was entertainment. Someone who saw trauma as a ratings opportunity, and Sir Cliff was not having it. The booking itself had been a victory for the show. They had spent months chasing it, knowing that Cliff's appearance would draw an enormous audience. His memoir, The Dreamer, was climbing bestsellers lists at a pace no one expected. His European tour was nearly sold out. His message of faith, resilience, and survival, after 2 years of hell, resonated deeply with audiences who had witnessed his public ordeal. This was supposed to be a celebration interview, a warm, respectful conversation with one of the most decorated artists in British history. His publicist had been meticulous, as was necessary ever since the nightmare began. The guidelines were clear: focus on the book, highlight the 6-decade career, discuss the upcoming tour, touch on charity work and accomplishments. Absolutely no ambush questions about the investigation, an investigation that had consumed 2 years of his life, an investigation that was televised, sensationalized, and weaponized, an investigation that destroyed his privacy, and an investigation that ultimately cleared him completely. The producers agreed. They understood the stakes. They knew Cliff's history, knew the weight of what he endured. They knew the pain the false accusations caused him, and how the British media had acted less like journalists and more like vultures circling a wounded man. They promised this interview would be respectful, uplifting, celebratory, but one person wasn't on board: Joy Behar. From the moment she walked into the production meeting that morning, she made her agenda known. "I'm not doing some piece on an aging British singer," she scoffed. "People deserve the real story." Her real story, of course, was the same ignorant, harmful narrative that people who have never lived through false accusations love to promote: that being investigated implies guilt, that exoneration isn't enough, that clearing someone's name still leaves questions, that smoke must mean fire, even when the smoke was manufactured by tabloids and opportunists. What Joy failed to understand, what she could not understand, was the trauma of being falsely accused. The terror of watching your home raided on live TV, the humiliation of seeing your name dragged through the mud, the helplessness of waiting for truth to be recognized while lies dominate headlines, the exhaustion of having your character dissected by strangers who know nothing about your life. She didn't understand how a 2-year ordeal changes a person, how it scars them, how it teaches them that some wounds, even when healed, remain tender forever, Cliff Richard didn't survive that ordeal by allowing people to keep reopening those wounds. He survived because he was stronger than anyone realized, because his faith never wavered, because he believed, even when the world felt unjust, that truth always wins, and it did. He was fully exonerated. Cleared on every level, the accusations were dismissed, the evidence disproved, the narrative dismantled, but Joy didn't care about truth. She cared about provocation. She cared about the moment. She cared about being the host who asked the tough question, even if the question was cruel, outdated, irrelevant, and deeply harmful. She didn't care that the trauma had nearly broken him. She didn't care that rehashing it served no purpose. She didn't care that reopening old wounds wasn't journalism, it was cruelty. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. This isn't a story about whether celebrities must answer every question. It isn't about whether public figures should expect scrutiny. It isn't about whether fame removes the right to privacy. This is about something else entirely. It's about whether resolved trauma fully investigated, legally dismissed, painfully survived should still be used as ammunition for ratings. It's about whether someone who has already endured a public crucifixion should be forced to endure it again for the sake of television drama. It's about whether people who have never lived through such terror have any right to drag others back into it. And Sir Cliff Richard, a man who lived through the darkest days of his life, under the glare of a merciless media, was not about to let it happen again. This moment, this collision between a man who had survived the unthinkable and a host who believed she was delivering hard, hitting journalism, was never really about questions. It was about the difference between legitimate inquiry and something far darker. The difference between journalism that seeks truth and cruelty dressed up as accountability, between asking honest questions and launching calculated attacks, between holding powerful people responsible and refusing to accept that an investigation's conclusions matter more than your own predetermined narrative. Joy Behar thought she was being brave, that she was the lone voice willing to ask what other hosts were too intimidated to ask. She imagined herself speaking for all the hypothetical viewers who supposedly still didn't believe in Cliff Richard's innocence. But what she was actually doing, what she unwittingly exposed in real time, was the reason false accusations continue to destroy lives long after someone has been declared innocent. Because there will always be people who cling harder to suspicion than to facts. People more invested in maintaining someone's guilt than accepting their innocence. People who cannot accept being proven wrong and instead keep poking, keep questioning, keep wounding. And when Sir Cliff Richard, who had maintained grace through the darkest period of his life, who had emerged from hell with his faith and dignity intact, who had spent 6 decades proving his character through consistent action rather than convenient words, finally reached his limit with Joy's particular brand of prosecutorial interrogation. What unfolded wasn't just explosive daytime television. It was a masterclass in recognizing exactly when someone is trying to destroy you, refusing to participate in your own destruction, and walking away from rooms where truth no longer matters because the narrative was written long before you ever walked in. Buckle up, because what you're about to witness is not just a heated clash on The View. It's a moment in which a man who survived the worst that false allegations can do finally told someone who had never experienced anything remotely similar exactly where they could go, delivered with such controlled fury, such elegant precision, that even the host who started it seemed to realize she had picked the wrong person to corner. The View studio hummed with its usual late morning electricity. Audience members settled into their seats with the eager anticipation that comes whenever someone truly legendary is about to take the stage. Sir Cliff Richard didn't make frequent American talk show rounds. His career, while globally successful, was deeply rooted in the UK, and any American appearance from him carried a sense of occasion. Today was no different. As the show's upbeat opening music faded, Whoopi Goldberg leaned into her introduction with unmistakable warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only, Sir Cliff Richard." The audience erupted. Applause rippled through the studio as Cliff walked out with the polish of a man who'd been doing this for 60 years. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his navy suit crisp, his smile generous but grounded. He waved with the practiced ease of an icon who had performed before millions yet still appreciated each welcome. "Thank you so much for having me," he said in his unmistakable British accent as he settled into the guest chair. "It's truly wonderful to be here in New York." Whoopi beamed at him with genuine admiration. "We're thrilled to have you, Sir Cliff. Your memoir, The Dreamer, is climbing the bestseller lists on both sides of the Atlantic. What inspired you to finally tell your story now, after all these years?" Cliff's face lit up, a soft brightness settling over him as he leaned forward slightly. The question clearly touched something meaningful in him. "Well, Whoopi," he began, "after 6 decades in this business, you collect a lot of stories, some joyful, some painful, all of them part of the journey. I felt it was time, not just to talk about the music, though there's plenty of that, but to share the friendships, the lessons, the challenges, and most importantly, the faith that sustained me through every season of my life." Sarah Haynes nodded thoughtfully. "The book is incredibly honest about your faith journey and how deeply it grounded you during difficult times. That must have been a vulnerable thing to write about." "It was," Cliff admitted, his voice softened, a slight heaviness entering it. "But I believe authenticity resonates. My faith has carried me through everything, the triumphs and the storms. Without it, I'm not sure I would have survived some of what I faced." The word storms drifted between them, understated yet unmistakable. Everyone in the room knew what he meant. The investigation, the media onslaught, the years of trauma that nearly consumed him until his complete exoneration. His publicist had requested that the topic be approached with sensitivity, and up until now, the hosts had honored that boundary gracefully. Everyone except Joy Behar. Joy had been sitting unusually quiet, a rarity for her, leaning back with an expression that seasoned viewers recognized. She was waiting for the conversation to pivot, for the opening she could exploit, for her moment to play the fearless interrogator. And as the conversation shifted naturally toward Cliff's resilience and recovery, Joy leaned forward at last. A smile curled across her face, sharp, calculated, not quite reaching her eyes. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop a degree. "Speaking of storms, Cliff," she began, her voice sliced through the warm atmosphere like a blade. The audience stiffened, the crew felt it. Even Whoopi's posture changed, pulling back slightly as if bracing for impact. Joy wasn't here to celebrate his book. She wasn't here to honor his resilience or acknowledge his innocence. She was here for the confrontation she believed would make good television. But what she didn't realize, what she would soon learn, was that Cliff Richard, after everything he'd endured, was no longer a man who would sit politely while someone tried to rewrite the meaning of his own survival. And the moment he recognized the intention behind her question, everything shifted. The words landed in the studio like a sudden gust of freezing air. Even through the bright lights and rehearsed smiles, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees the moment Joy Behar spoke. Cliff Richard kept his expression pleasant, polished, professional, the way someone with 6 decades of media training instinctively did, but anyone paying attention would have noticed the small tells. The slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the subtle lift of his chin, the shift in posture from relaxed guest to man quietly preparing for battle. He had walked onto this set expecting celebration, conversation, perhaps nostalgia, not confrontation. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Joy," Cliff said carefully. His tone remained warm enough to pass as cordial, but there was unmistakable steel beneath it, the tone of a man who had learned, painfully, what it felt like to have his dignity stripped from him on live television before. "You'll have to be a bit more specific." Joy waved a hand through the air in a way that suggested she neither cared to be specific nor believed she needed to be. It was the kind of dismissive gesture that communicated boredom with boundaries, impatience with nuance. "Oh, come on. The investigations, the allegations. Don't you think it's a little convenient?" she continued, leaning forward slightly as though she just cornered something fragile. "That you're here promoting a book about redemption and faith right after all that mess." Whoopi Winfrey shot Joy a warning look, sharp, unmistakable, the kind that only seasoned co-hosts exchange when one of them is steering the show off a cliff. They had agreed on the content of this interview. They had promised the publicist, they had rehearsed the questions, and Joy was now veering into territory no one had approved. But Joy was energized, almost delighted, by the tension she had created. For her, this wasn't an interview anymore. It was a hunt, The other hosts shifted uncomfortably, hands clasping their cards, eyes darting toward producers just offstage. What had begun as a standard promotional segment, a legend reflecting on a 60-year career, was rapidly turning into something far more volatile, something none of them wanted to be associated with. Meanwhile, Cliff's demeanor was changing right before them. The warmth remained, but it had frozen into something controlled and vigilant, like a gate slowly closing. "Joy," he said, and this time his voice carried the crisp edge of someone no longer willing to be polite for politeness' sake. "I think you're conflating very different situations, and doing so deliberately." His words hung in the air with a weight that immediately shifted the dynamic of the room. "The matter you're alluding to was thoroughly investigated by the South Yorkshire Police for 2 years." He held up 2 fingers, as if to physically show the length of time. 2 years of my life, and I was completely exonerated, not partially cleared, not lack of evidence, completely exonerated. Joy actually scoffed, a sharp, incredulous exhalation that echoed across the silently watching audience. It was the kind of sound people made when they didn't believe the facts, when they preferred their chosen narrative over the documented truth. "Exonerated is a strong word," she replied. "Just because charges weren't filed doesn't mean. It means exactly that." Cliff cut in, and now the crack in his polished composure was visible. Not anger, something deeper, more bruised. "It means I was innocent of any wrongdoing, which I always was and always will be. The police found nothing because there was nothing to find." The audience had gone utterly silent. Not the playful hush of anticipation, but the thick, tense quiet of people witnessing a line being crossed. This was no longer an interview. This was an interrogation, and everyone could feel it. But Joy wasn't finished. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and leveled a look at him as though she were grilling a politician instead of speaking to a man whose life had been torn apart by a false accusation. "But surely," she said slowly, savoring the moment, "you understand why some people might still be skeptical. These types of allegations don't just come out of nowhere." One of the other hosts, Sonny, desperate to rescue the situation, jumped in. "Joy, maybe we should focus on the book, the actual content he worked so hard on." "No, no," Joy said sharply, slicing the air with her hand. Her voice held a finality that tolerated no interruption. "This is exactly what we should be talking about. Accountability, transparency, not just feel. Good stories about faith and redemption when there are still real questions left unanswered." Cliff's jaw tightened. It was small, almost invisible, but the camera caught it. A man who had spent years learning to keep his face neutral in front of relentless press pressure could not entirely hide the sting. This wasn't just disrespect, it was cruelty. It was reopening a wound that had barely healed, a wound inflicted not by truth, but by speculation, sensationalism, and the insatiable hunger of people who preferred scandal over fact. He inhaled slowly, visibly collecting himself. "There are no unanswered questions," he said, voice quieter now but far more dangerous. "There never were. What you're doing right now isn't journalism, Joy. It's the exact behavior that destroyed my reputation, damaged my health, and cost me years of my life. You're repeating narratives that were proven false because you find them more interesting than the truth." A murmur rippled through the audience. Joy blinked surprise, not by his words, but by the realization that he was no longer playing along. Cliff Richard, the gentleman of British pop, the soft-spoken icon known for grace and composure, was finally pushing back. "And he wasn't done. You invited me here to talk about my book, my career, my music. You agreed, your producers agreed, that my trauma would not be used as entertainment fodder, and here you are doing exactly that." The room was still charged, waiting. Cliff paused, then leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive but unignorable. "I will not allow you," he said, "to take the worst period of my life, one I survived only by the grace of God, and twist it for ratings. It was the turning point no one in the studio would forget." Joy leaned back in her chair, arms loosely folded, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I call it suspicious," she declared, the satisfaction in her voice unmistakable. She looked as though she had just scored a point in a game only she understood. "Innocent people don't usually react this way to simple questions." "Simple questions," Cliff repeated, his voice rising despite his efforts to hold himself together. Every sentence in the last 10 minutes had chipped away at his composure, and now the cracks were vividly visible. "You've spent this entire interview implying I'm some kind of criminal. You practically accused me of using charity work as a front for misconduct. You've suggested my faith is fake, my book is dishonest, my life is a facade, and you have the audacity to call those simple questions." Sarah Haynes, the show's moderator, instinctively leaned forward, her expression tense and her voice softening like someone trying to defuse a live explosive. "Why don't we shift gears?" she suggested gently. "Maybe we could talk about your upcoming tour, or the new music you've been working on." But Cliff wasn't listening. His gaze remained locked on Joy, unwavering, as though she were the only person in the room. "No," he said, his tone firm and controlled in a way that hinted at danger. "We're going to finish this conversation, because this," he gestured sharply toward Joy, "is exactly what's wrong with modern media. People like her think they can destroy someone's reputation based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. They build a narrative first and then twist everything, facts, timelines, statements, to fit it." Joy actually laughed. The sound was sharp, metallic, almost theatrical. It echoed through the suddenly hushed studio. Her smile grew wider, colder. "Oh, this is rich," she said, shaking her head slowly. "And now I'm the villain because I asked some tough questions. Please, this is exactly why victims stay silent. Because powerful men like you twist everything until you're the ones who look hurt, while everyone else is painted as manipulative or dishonest." "Victims," Cliff repeated. The word struck something deep inside him. His control wavered completely. "You want to talk about victims? Then let's talk about victims." The studio was so quiet that even Cliff's unsteady breathing sounded loud. "Victims are the children I've spent my career trying to help," he said, voice trembling not with fear, but with outrage. "Real children, real problems, real change. Victims are the fans who have been confused, heartbroken, and misled by malicious rumors spread by people who don't care about truth, only about drama. Victims are innocent people whose lives are ripped apart by baseless accusations while spectators cheer." Assuming that smoke must mean fire, his hand clenched on the armrest. He looked as though he were holding onto the last thread of restraint. Across from him, Joy sat back with a slow, satisfied exhale, the kind one makes after successfully setting a trap. Her smile had the unmistakable air of someone who believed she had just extracted exactly the reaction she wanted, the kind she could later package, clip, and frame as evidence. "Are you finished with your little tantrum?" she asked coolly. The word tantrum landed like a spark in a room full of dry tinder. Something in Cliff snapped, not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet finality of a bridge burning. His face went pale, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with an intensity that made even the camera operators glance at each other uneasily. And when he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was deadly soft, the kind of quiet that carries more threat than shouting ever could. "Tantrum," he whispered. The entire studio leaned in to hear him. "You think this is a tantrum?" He paused for a moment, breathing in deeply, as if forcing the words out with careful precision. "This is what happens when a decent person, someone who has spent 60 years trying to do good, finally stands up to a bully who thinks tearing others down is entertainment." For the first time, Joy's smirk faltered. It was brief, just a flicker, but unmistakable. Still, she quickly recomposed herself. "Bully, I'm a journalist," she insisted. "I'm asking legitimate questions." Cliff laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was hollow, bitter, edged with disbelief. The sound echoed through the silent studio like the crack of glass. "Is that what you call yourself, a journalist?" he asked. "Real journalists deal in facts, not character assassination. Real journalists investigate instead of assuming. Real journalists don't take someone who has been thoroughly examined, publicly cleared, and officially exonerated, and continue to imply guilt because it makes for a more dramatic show." "I've done my research," Joy shot back, but for the first time, uncertainty crept into her tone. "I know about the allegations, the investigation, the settlement." Cliff interrupted, his voice rising sharply. "What settlement?" "There was no settlement because there was no case." The words reverberated through the studio like a strike of thunder. His voice dropped again to that same dangerous whisper. "And you know that," he said, "you know the truth. You just don't care. The cameras kept rolling. No one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. The interview, which had started as a routine promotional appearance, had spiraled into a raw, explosive confrontation, one that none of them would soon forget.